I'm Drew Kursak, Pioneer Rep from Exeter, Ontario, and this is the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast.
Thanks, Drew, and thank you for listening to the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast. As corn and soybeans continue to develop, the focus for you as a grain grower has likely shifted from the rush of planting and weed control to now scouting for potential issues and then troubleshooting them. The question that we want to answer today is, what should we be looking for, and what can we do to make sure the soybean crop can reach its full potential? When it comes to who to ask, I'm not sure we could find two better voices to help answer our questions. Greg Stopps is a Pioneer Area Agronomist and a familiar guest on our podcast, and Horst Bohner is the soybean specialist for the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. Horst, Greg, thanks very much for joining us today.
Yes, thanks for the invitation. It'll be fun.
Oh, thank you so much for having us on. It's great to be back with you, Andrew, and it's really good to be on this time with the premier soybean expert in our province. So now I can lean on someone else in this format.
You're not going to start that way, are you, Greg?
Oh, I am, yeah.
Just get buttered up right off the bat. That's a good way to start. Well, you know what? I'm excited to have both of you on here because I think what I really want to do in today's episode, what we really thought would be an important thing to do, is just kind of take stock of the season. We're midway through. So far, we tend to talk a lot about, kind of big issues or big things we need to think about. This one, I just kind of wanted to take a little more broad strokes on the soybean crop in general. It's early July. We're mid-season. I kind of want to get an idea of, okay, they're in the ground. They're coming up. What's done is done. But what can we do now to protect that crop and hopefully protect that yield? What I'm wondering first is, okay, one of the first things, and this is from talking to folks like you, Greg, is I got to scout. I got to go out and actually see what's in my soybean field. Greg, what am I looking for this time of year?
So I think there's a couple key things that we're looking for, right? And you're, we've got the crop in the ground. Hopefully we've got all of our weed management down and things are looking good in that regard. So in my mind, we have to be honest, there's limited things that we can do to really manage through. Not everything can be managed at this point now that the crop's in the ground, but there are a couple key things that we can do for management mid-season to set ourselves up for success, right? And so the things I'm primarily looking for, number one is disease. And in southwestern Ontario, we have some disease pressure out there. And the first thing that comes to my mind is white mold. And we've talked about that here on previous podcast episodes. But there's other diseases, leaf diseases and things as well. Beyond diseases, I think about insects, right? And, there are a number of different insect pests that can crop up. They don't seem to be quite as widespread maybe as some of the diseases that we face. There are pockets of them. They're not always uniform across a field, but insect pressure can be pretty serious for yield and needs to be managed. And I'd say the third kind of bucket of things that I'm looking for is nutrient deficiency. There's not a whole lot we can do about some of those, but some of the micronutrient deficiencies and even some of the more extreme macronutrient deficiencies, like with potash, can be fed a little bit of foliar to help with easing some of that stress in season. It's not perfect. It's not going to save you completely, but it might get you a few more bushels in terms of management if you're in a situation where you're lacking something.
So then that's a good checklist, Horst, to kind of start going through in terms of what we can actually do. Maybe we'll start where you finished off, Greg, in terms of that kind of nutrient deficiency, in terms of those micronutrients. Horst, which ones are kind of the flags for this time of year that we can actually do something about?
Yeah, I think Greg has hit on this issue of nutrients because, at this time of year, when you are looking at soybeans, often they don't have the right color, right? They have this yellow chlorotic look. And then if you look closely at the leaves, sometimes there's yellowing around the edge or the whole leaf is yellow. That's a very bad sign. If your crop is turning yellow, you're losing yield, guaranteed. And it can be a lot of yield. And because those leaves are no longer photosynthetic. And the other thing you have to realize, when the plant turns yellow, it is showing you that it is deeply, deeply stressed, right? And in the past, we used to downplay stress on plants, especially early on, but we're really past that in the soybean world. We feel now to get maximum yield, 70, maybe even 80 bushels if we really get lucky, you want no stress through the whole growing season. So let's get to answering your question. The big ones in Ontario are potassium, or K, and manganese, or Mn, in terms of those visual symptoms. And that also corresponds to where we see the biggest yield losses. So with respect to potassium, it's a big nutrient, macronutrient. We need lots of it. So we have a challenge in foliar feeding. There are products for sure, but you got to remember, when you use one of those products, you're basically only putting on enough K for 1 day in terms of consumption. So you're really only just helping to alleviate a little bit of stress, hoping to get you to the next rain, hoping just to feed it a little bit, but you're not really addressing the nutrient deficiency, is what I'm getting at, in any significant way. So if the bean plant is still small, let's say pre-flowering or just flowering, let's say it was planted a little bit later, right? And you've got that potassium kind of deficiency, you can still bulk spread broadcast. We used to, when I started, we'd say, don't do that at all. It's a complete waste of time. I've done it a number of times now, where when we have a potassium deficiency, just get out there and broadcast 0060. And yeah, if it doesn't rain for the next 6 weeks, it won't help. That's true. But you know what? We're not going to have much of a crop if it doesn't rain for the next 6 weeks. My point is, as soon as you get a rain, because the vast majority, 80% of the roots of soybeans are in the top 3 inches, we still get a nice response. I've seen up to 6 bushels to a deficient field broadcasting 0060, right? Now, again, back to Greg's point in terms of these foliar feeding, that is, of course, the more traditional way to try and feed these crops at this stage. And that leads me to manganese. Manganese is a big one. It's a micronutrient, has a little different symptomology than potassium deficiency. But boy, as soon as you see it, get that stuff on there. Get the foliar manganese product on there. We're talking 5 to 8 bushel total response if you have a truly deficient manganese field.
So do you see that too, Greg, then when you're scouting customer fields, like whether it's in broadcast or whether it's that foliar application, that giving in that feed, maybe pushing it that little bit to, as Horst put it, to the next rain, whatever, to just get it out of the stress, that it's worthwhile at least thinking about?
Yeah, I certainly see that it's worthwhile, right? Not maybe all scenarios, but in general, I would say, it is worthwhile thinking about those applications if you are short, right? The rain is the key, right? The rain is so much the key for making yield in soybeans at that flowering timing. And if you do not have it, right, none of these rescue treatments will really, carry you through. But, you've got to do something. It's pretty clear that if that rain comes and you don't have the application, you may not get full alleviation. You may need to, or you may have already lost, some yield, versus if you put that application on, especially some of the foliar manganese products and even some of the other foliar micro products, can help you limp through to that timely rain, and you won't realize quite as much loss in yield. So I'm a big proponent of, if you see those, seriously consider making those applications. And then, there are other things too that we probably don't talk about in terms of nutrients, right? Where, they may not be manageable in season, but we need to acknowledge them, right? If you are running into nutrient deficiencies on your soybeans, right, not all of those nutrients are going to be able to be addressable in season. We might see some yield loss. We might see these rescue applications help us prevent some of that yield loss, but we need to seriously kind of take note of those areas in the field too that are causing those problems, and then do our due diligence come fall with some of the soil sampling, make sure those levels are at where they need to be, and plan for the future crop, right? So we're going to need to do that whatever crop we rotate into, but we're going to need to have good notes on that coming back to beans in that field in the future.
So then one other area that you had mentioned, Greg, and maybe I'll throw this to you first, Horst, this time, is that disease side of things. And it's funny how short our memories are. Like when you said the term white mold, I got this like shiver up my back of, oh yeah, that was last year. Like you almost forget, how recent that is and how much of a response I know we found from, that issue. White mold's one, Horst. What are some other ones, or where does it rank on the priority in terms of diseases and that scouting we need to do for the next little while to make sure that we are protecting it that way?
Right. So yeah, for sure, white mold is the biggest yield robber, but it's very specific, right, in terms of the fields and the locations and the years, because you need the right kind of weather conditions, as we all know, right, cool and wet. And then you also need to have a history of white mold in that field to really have the inoculum take, right? So if the field, for instance, has never had white mold before, you're not going to go to a place where you have a huge problem with white mold. And so that's one, right? But there are others. This year I'm seeing a fair bit of brown spot, Septoria brown spot. It's usually not considered a big yield robber, but hey, all these things start to nibble away, right? So brown spot, then we've got frog eye leaf spot. We've got in some cases later in the season, we've got even phomopsis, right, which really impacts seed quality. And so here's the crux of the problem, right? All that to say, and we could, Greg and I could come up with a list of 10 things we see in Ontario here, but that's really not the point. The point is all of these diseases need to be controlled preventatively, right? You got to get that spray on to protect the flowers, protect the foliage fairly early, right? And so that's where the challenge really starts. Now, some of them, of course, you can have a little bit of development and boom, you see it, you take care of the problem. But for something like white mold specifically, right, if you're waiting, and we'll get this call mid-August, I've got white mold, what do I do? And the answer is usually nothing, right? You live with it now. It's too late to really control white mold. You can hit it on the head a little bit, but so my point is, we talk about these diseases as though we can scout and then make the decision. It's not quite that simple. So Greg, I don't know what you think. If you want to talk about a one pass versus a two pass strategy for the control of some of these diseases, let's start with a scenario where we don't have a lot of white mold pressure, but we know we've had some of these other leaf diseases. And where is your recommendation when someone calls you and says, listen, white mold is not my primary concern, but I do want to spray a foliar fungicide this year. When do I spray?
So that's a really good scenario, right? And that's a difficult one for a lot of us to kind of work through, right? I think if I'm thinking about just leaf diseases, right, and I fully agree with what you said earlier about it's very hard to scout for things and then get them applied and have it all work, right? Especially with white mold. I do find it's maybe a little bit easier with some of the other leaf diseases. And so, scouting does still factor into a scenario like this one where we're talking about other leaf diseases. part of my head goes to get it on and get it on specifically at that R1 timing or R1 and a half, maybe, right when those flowers first come out, right? And the goal of that timing is really just to protect the plant at flowering, in my mind, right? And you had alluded to earlier when we talked about nutrients, you talked a little bit about how stressed the plant is, right? That when it's showing those nutrient deficiencies, right? And at flowering timing, we don't always see if there's not any nutrient deficiencies, we don't always see the stress that they're under, but they can be under significant stress from some of these diseases, right? Which leads to flower abortion, which leads to less potential pods being set, right? We want to ease the stress on those plants as much as possible so that those flowers have every possible chance of getting properly pollinated and setting a pod, right? And the more pods, the better. That's directly linked to your yield, right? So my recommendation is if you think you have any pressure of leaf diseases, make sure you get that spray on. If you've already scouted and seen that pressure, right, then I'm not going to tell you to wait to R1 if you're still before that. I'm going to tell you to get that spray on as soon as possible and try to stop that disease from progressing any further. But if you just have a history of some of that pressure and know it's going to probably show up, I'll try to encourage you to get that fungicide on, and that timing that I usually like it on is as close to flower as possible, so we're easing the stress on those flowers. And that I think remains true for white mold as well. Timing for white mold to me depends on your field history and your pressure in your scenario. If you've got a huge history of white mold and you have a field that's got a pile of manure on it too, really rich, kind of fertile ground where those beans get pretty big and lush as it is, where the canopy chokes itself out from kind of any fresh air movement, then, maybe one pass isn't enough for you, right? In another environment where maybe you have a little bit more breathability in the canopy, a little less fertility, one pass might be the right solution for you, even if you have white mold pressure, right? And if I'm going with one pass, I'm kind of leaning towards that R1.5, R2. If I'm going to go with two passes, I'm going early at R1 and coming back in probably closer to R3 for a second pass.
Yeah, it's certainly a can of worms, and I will address it. I just so we have a little controversy here this during this podcast, I got to push back a little bit against something you said there, and we're all on the same page, so I'm teasing a little bit. But in our trials, when we go with a one pass system, we don't want to go too early. And you said R1 a couple times. For white mold control, I think, yes, I can wrap my brain around, but you got to remember, and you know this, of course, but when guys say R1, they see, one flower in the field and the beans are at the fourth trifoliate. In other words, it's too early. When you say R1, you mean 50% of the field has an open flower. And of course, R2 or full bloom is when you have an open flower on one of the top two nodes. All that to say is, I think we can go too early sometimes, and these guys like to put it in with the last pass of Roundup. That is not the right time. You need to think about it as a separate pass. And if you're going with a one pass strategy, R2 full bloom is kind of, I think, the right one. But to your point, if you're trying to protect the flowers for white mold, you go a little bit earlier than R2, and then 10 to 14 days later, which gets you to R3. So anyway, I'm not really correcting you. I'm just pushing back a little bit. In the field, guys like to put in that fungicide with the second pass of Roundup, and it's just not the right timing, right?
Yes, I agree. You certainly can go too early there, right? So erring on slightly later, making sure you have flower, like you said, on 50%.
And I do want to go back to your point, Greg, in terms of that pass no matter what scenario, because it actually fits with the fact that if you look at the economics right now, now's the time. If you're applying, it's years like this to be applying. So, Horst, is that the right mentality to, beans are good money, why don't we just spray no matter what? Should we even bother scouting? Should we just make that application?
Well, let's be clear. In Ontario, we have always and will continue to go down the road of using pesticides when they are necessary to control a specific pest, right? That is why we use pesticides, including fungicides and insecticides. So that's where I'll leave that. Now, when it comes to the average yield response, it's in my trials, and we have over 100 fungicide trials now. You know, we've been doing this since 2004 every year. I believe in fungicides. The average response is 2.3 bushels per acre. In that data set, we'll have 4 bushels. If we have white mold, we'll have up to 8 or 10 or 12 bushel response. We'll have a lot of zeros too, obviously, to get to a 2.3 bushel average. But if you take that 2.3 bushel average, it does not take a genius to do the math there, and it's not a bad scenario in a year like this with prices the way they are, right? So, you know, there you go. There's my government answer. We apply pesticides to control pests. The average response is 2.2 bushels.
So I think, you know, you're right, Horst, in that. So to me, there is something to that prophylactic application, right? But as an agronomist, right, and yourself as an extension specialist, and for everyone out there listening, right, and farming, right, there is a huge responsibility in the integrated pest management world, right? And with the advent of diseases that are showing some resistance, like frog eye, and I think there's been some great work here in Ontario done to show that there are some populations of resistant frog eye showing up to some of the fungicides. It's important to remember that prophylactic use long term gets us into trouble. That 2.3 bushels can be very, very attractive from a price point, but from a stewardship standpoint, I think it is important to make sure we are going after a disease when we justify that application, right?
No, I agree wholehearted, and we're trying to be sincere and tell both sides of the story here for sure. I mean, over the years, I've worked with growers in other countries, such as you know, these big growers in the Ukraine. There's huge acreage in the Ukraine of soybeans, and of course, those growers, you know, they have so many acres to cover. Here's the point of the story: they don't scout. They're not even interested in your conversation. All they want is a schedule. How many days after planting do I spray? And then when do I apply the fungicides? Don't even talk to me about growth stages. I don't even know what you're talking about, and I don't care. I want the days after planting, and they have a calendar, and that's the way they grow soybeans. Is that a road we want to go down? No, I don't think it is. I don't think it's the way we want to grow soybeans. But certainly there are people that do that. If you go to Brazil, where they have a lot of insects, again, you spray, right? And so there you go. But we're fortunate in Ontario here that we have not needed to do that, right?
Well, and I appreciate that element of the conversation, and it leads well into, I think, the third point that you mentioned, Greg, and you can kind of lead this one off, is on the insect side, because, I mean, Horst, I didn't know that they did that in Brazil. They just sprayed no matter what on insects. We're not doing that here in Ontario. We are taking that IPM approach. But at the same time, you know, at this time of year, what insects, Greg, are we needing to be looking out for, and at what stage do we need to be taking some action?
So there's a number of insects that certainly can have a big impact on our fields, right? And those tend to be regionally specific in some regards. But the big ones kind of on my mind that we're watching out for are, of course, the bean leaf beetle, which can defoliate a lot of those leaves. We're looking for sometimes Japanese beetle that can do the same thing. There's some stink bug issues. There's all kinds of things. And then, of course, we think about aphids as well, especially when things get a little drier. We think about spider mites. All of those pests can be a significant issue and more, right? And there is control options for them. And like you said, I think we probably lean a little bit more towards the true IPM management strategies with pests, thankfully. And we have some really nice defined thresholds for most of those too, right? And what's important for the grower to keep in mind, and this episode is going to be released hopefully mid-July, right? So we're hopefully flowering or starting to get into really good flowering period. And the thresholds at flowering tend to be a lot lower in terms of percent defoliation than they can be at vegetative stages, right? So, we see some of these pest pressures early on in a season after planting, and some of those aren't really of huge concern. Like, you can get defoliation up to 40% of the plant and not really end up with a big problem, right? But for some of these pests, when things are flowering, it can be 5 to 15% defoliation that triggers that application. So we need to watch closely. We need to scout carefully. And a lot of the time with some of the pests, they're quite patchy within a field. So in terms of an IPM strategy, it may not be necessary to go over your entire field and spray. When you've got spider mites, a lot of the time they congregate along headlands and along ditch banks and roadsides, right? And then they kind of move into the field from there. They don't very often justify an entire field pass, maybe just a pass around the headlands and the sides of the field, right? To fully take care of them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Greg. I mean, the issue around insects in Ontario is often just part of a field, or it's regional. The one time, or the few times, let's put it that way, we've had a different scenario is, of course, usually associated with dry years, right? And it's too early yet in the season to know whether it's truly going to be a dry year or a wet year. And in soybeans, we talk about that in August. But here's the point. If it's a dry year, those spider mites really do a lot of damage, right? It's a compounding thing. And you can just physically tell by looking at the plants. They, again, aren't that deep color. They're a bit of a yellow color. And then, of course, around the edges, they even get stunted around the edges of the field, that kind of thing. So we absolutely need to control spider mites. And, of course, the other big one that, again, it's very regional, is soybean aphids, and in my part of the world, every few years we seem to get a little bit of a blip, and in Eastern Ontario. Now, there's one thing that I hesitate to even bring up, but it's just a reality. You need to be aware that many of the populations of spider mites that we have in Ontario are resistant to the pesticide that we use on them. It's a problem. We're aware of the problem, but we've had complete failures to spraying spider mites, and we do not have at this time a good answer for that. There's people working on registering new products, but it is a significant issue.
It seems like rain is the one answer for them.
Right.
and oddly enough, rain is probably the answer for many of our mid-season management issues and that yield potential and protecting it, right? We've talked about a lot of things on this episode, Andrew, from fungicides and diseases to nutrient deficiencies and now insects as we finish off. But a huge part of our management season, to me, our mid-season management is always just hoping and praying for the right amount of rain at the right time to make that yield, right? Without that rain in August, all of these management strategies on soybeans, unfortunately, can fall apart pretty quickly, right?
Well, gentlemen, I really appreciate you walking us all through a few ideas, obviously scouting being the big one, but then, kind of just looking after and trying to relieve whatever stress those soybean plants seem to be under. So once again, Horst, Greg, thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
On behalf of myself and the entire team working behind the scenes on this, thanks so much for listening to our final episode of the third season of the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast. If you haven't already, make sure to listen back to our first and second season episodes for more practical tips that focus on making sure you have the latest information on improving your bottom line. Don't forget, you can always get in touch if you'd like on Twitter at the handle Pioneer Seeds CA or my personal handle, Fresh Air Farmer. And for more info or advice, talk to your local Pioneer rep or visit pioneer.com/Canada.